My name is Dan Erikson. I'm Managing Director of Blue Star Strategies, a consulting firm in Washington. And I'm very pleased to be here today because the issue of China and Latin America is very dear to my heart. In a previous phase of my career, while I was at the State Department, I helped to organize the U.S.-China dialogues on Latin America. I had the opportunity to travel to Beijing and Shanghai with U.S. officials to meet with our counterparts in the Chinese Foreign Ministry and really try to deepen the mutual understanding between our countries around what was happening in the region. In addition, I'm a huge fan of Mexico. I think Mexico City is one of the great cities of the world. One of my highlights of my time at the White House when I traveled here with Vice President Joe Biden about 2 years ago for the high-level economic dialogue. I really have very fond memories from that. But most importantly, and I think the reason that we're all here today, is that China is an important topic. It's an important topic for the world, it's an important topic for the United States, and it's important for Mexico. And we're really going to use this time here to try to delve more deeply into what is happening in China politically, economically, domestically, and then how that global strategy is going to be taken around the world. I'm really honored to have two top experts here with me. Our first speaker will be Dingding Chen. Dr. Chen is a professor of international relations at Jinan University in Guangzhou. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Global Public Policy Institute in Germany, and also the founding director of a foreign policy institute in China. So he's going to begin our discussion, and then he'll be followed by Professor Brantly Womack. Professor Womack is a Cumming Memorial Professor of Foreign Affairs at UVA. He's one of the most widely published scholars on China and China's international relations in the world. He has a tremendous amount of knowledge about this. He has several books. They asked us to keep the bios short, so not all of the books are on his short bio there. But he's the author of Asymmetry in International Relationships, China Among Equals, Asymmetric Foreign Relations in Asia. And also, a while back, although it was not listed, he wrote a book on the foundations of Mao Zedong's political thought. And so with that, we're going to begin this conversation. Each of our panelists will speak for a while, and then we'll have a short discussion on stage before we move to the next group. Thank you very much. And Professor Chen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan, and I want to thank the organizer for your kind invitation. It's actually my first time to be here in Mexico City, and I instantly fell in love with the city because I'm from Guangzhou, which is very similar to Mexico City. Good weather, great food, and very warm people. So thank you so much for inviting me to be here. And it's my pleasure to join Professor Womack, a top expert in Chinese politics, to discuss this very important topic. I think, as Dan has already pointed out, China-Mexican relations is a very important relationship, not only for China, but also for Mexico and for other players in this region as well. And I think, as all of you know, that China is entering a new era, so to speak, under our leader, President Xi Jinping. And this new era certainly would have important policy implications or ramifications for not only China, but also other countries in Asia and beyond. So I think one of the purposes of this panel is to discuss what would be China's future strategy, what would be China's great strategy, so to speak, and what would be the implications of China's strategy for other players in this region and beyond. And I would like to address three main questions, given limited time. The first question I would like to address is, does China have a so-called grand strategy or not? And if so, what is the main content of this new grand strategy? And the second question is, what would China do in order to realize this new grand strategy in the future, let's say the next decade or next 2 decades? And the third question is, what will be the impact of China's new grand strategy on China-Mexico relations and also on this region and beyond? And about the first question, I hold the view that China does have a grand strategy or a new grand strategy. And this is so for 3 reasons. The first reason is if you look at China's foreign policy over the last 40 years or so, since 1978, when China began to open itself up to the outside world, since then, China has more or less adopted a strategy of what we would call laying low. And in Chinese, we call that 韬光养晦. Basically, it means keep a low profile, concentrate on your own domestic construction, mainly economic development. Do not try to be a regional leader or even a global leader in regional affairs and global affairs, because that's going to divert your attention, energy, so on and so forth. It's not really worth the efforts. So that strategy, more or less, I think has been maintained for 30 years or so, between 1978, 1979, until the year of global financial crisis around 2009. So that's 30 years, I think, more or less. Of course, there were different policy emphases under different leadership and in different time periods, but more or less in general, I would say that strategy, keeping a low profile, has been in general adopted by the leadership and all Chinese governments. But things started to change around the year of 2009. As we all know, that's the year of global financial crisis. That global financial crisis actually did serious damage to a number of global economies, and certainly including China. If you look at the GDP growth rates since 2009 to recent years, China's GDP growth rate before 2009 was for a lot, to a larger part of the first decade of the 21st century was about or around 10%. But after 2009, the growth rate gradually declined to 8%, 7%, and the last year 6.6, and maybe this year 2018 will be 6.4 or 5%, which is actually quite a good number compared to other major economies. But in the Chinese context, the slower growth is already a trend that's going to be with us for the next 10 years or so. But around 2009, that year, China already surpassed Japan as the #2 economy in the world, only behind the US. And now this is 2018, and China has already become even bigger in terms of GDP size. China's economic size is already 3 times of Japan's economy, and it's about 60 to 70% of the US GDP size. So this, I think, is the underlying reason why China has become more confident not only in its domestic economic situation, but also global affairs in general. So economic growth is the driving force behind China's new assertiveness or new policy change, or whatever you want to call it. So I would say this is the beginning of China's new grand strategy. Now, last year, 2017, when the Chinese government held the 19th Party Congress in October, our President Xi Jinping officially declared we are entering a new era. A new era is a major theme for our future understanding of Chinese politics and the Chinese foreign policy. So we don't know exactly what the new era would mean for our domestic policies and foreign policies, because a lot of the detailed policies need to be worked out gradually in the coming years. But I think the main thing is clear. We are entering a new era which is different from the last 30 years. We are going to adopt new policies, both in domestic realms and also in foreign policy realms. And that basically means China's foreign policy will be more active globally, because number one, China's interests have expanded globally into Africa, Latin America, Indian Ocean, and even the Arctic region. So everywhere you can find maybe Chinese restaurant. I found the Panda Express restaurant on my way to the hotel yesterday from the airport. So this is the reason: economic growth and expanding global interest in the network. Reason number one. And also, I think if we needed to analyze the content of this new grand strategy, we are not so sure yet, because a lot of the details, like I said, would need to be worked out later. But I think the main direction is clear. China is going to be more active, and even in some cases more assertive depending on the context you're looking at or the player's perspective. For example, in Asia, China's behavior might be seen as more assertive rather than more cooperative. And the second question I want to address is what will China do specifically? I think China would adhere to a multilateral framework in contrast to US President Donald Trump's more or less unilateral framework. And China would still be promoting, for example, global trade, climate change, and international poverty reduction efforts, supporting UN and other multilateral mechanisms. And one example I think everybody's already familiar with is China's One Belt One Road initiative, which started about 4 years ago. And a lot of people here in this region probably are wondering about the question, why is not Latin America part of the One Belt One Road initiative already? I don't have an answer because I'm from southern China, where the emperor is far away. I don't really know what's going on in Beijing. But my hunch would be that Latin America is not yet the top priority of the Chinese foreign policy. Our top priority is still our neighboring region, including Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, and the Indian Ocean. So Latin America is, of course, very, very important, and I would say even more important than Asia in the long run. For China's global role. The reason I think is quite simple, because China is already in Asia, and China is not in Latin America. So if China can demonstrate the Chinese presence or influence or even the Chinese model can be compatible with the local conditions in Latin America, then the Chinese way, the Chinese model can theoretically be applicable to other regions as well. So Latin America in the long run would be the golden testing case for the Chinese influence, but that's for the long-term planning. And the last question I would like to address is what would be the impact for China, Mexico, and Latin America as a whole? And I would say, again, I don't know the details, but I would say the direction is pretty clear. That is, China would increase trade, investment, financial cooperation, and more multilateral initiatives with regard to Latin America. And China would also encourage other countries, other players to join all these initiatives, such as the US, because a stable and peaceful and cooperative relationship between US and Mexico is actually going to help China-Mexico relations, for example, because otherwise the Chinese presence or influence in Mexico would be viewed with suspicion from the northern side, which is not very good for the Chinese impact or relations with other players in this region. So I think China will be very, very cautious about its dealing with Mexico and the other countries in this region. And China would also, like I said, try to invite the US to join this new initiative. And maybe it's extension of the One Belt One Road initiative, or it could be some other initiative like the Silk Road Fund. It could be theoretically extended to countries like Mexico and the other players in this region. So I think to conclude, I do have a positive view of this important relationship. I think it is indeed a win-win situation, even though we notice in China that win-win situation, cooperation, this sort of stock is not very much sometimes viewed positively by others. For them, win-win means China winning twice, so it's not really win-win. But I do think in this case, we can have a win-win situation, and we share similar history, we share similar development issues, and we share a lot of other experiences. And I would leave to Professor Womack to provide more detailed analysis. Thank you very much.
Well, it is a great pleasure and a great honor to be here. This is my first visit to Mexico City as well. It's been a very nice visit so far, and I'm looking forward to more. It's difficult to be the second speaker about China's grand strategy after my friend Dingding. I knew that he would present an excellent overview of Xi Jinping and China's plans, and that, as he indicated at the end, I would be left with adding the details and the footnotes. So I decided on another approach. My approach, instead of going for the details and the footnotes, is to discuss the general trends of the world political economy in which China's grand strategy takes place. So basically, that's in line with the new global order mentioned in the title of this seminar. And what is that new global order? Certainly China is a major part of it, but China's not the only part. And China's dynamics are not the only dynamics. So what I would like to emphasize are parameters of the development of the present and foreseeable future in the world political economy that might help us understand how China, how Mexico, how the United States fit in. And this is especially important now because we are still in the aftershocks of a global political earthquake. President Trump, it's hard to know when the aftershocks of the political earthquake will end. I would say that rather than any specific policy that President Trump has adopted, or any specific tweet for that matter, which is more problematic, the uncertainty of U.S. policy is something that disturbs not only people in the United States, but people around the world that must deal with the United States. Reminds me a little bit of como la fuente del Camino Real, the fountain at the Camino Real Hotel. There the water goes swishing round and round. And so what we need to do in those circumstances is not watch the water and get seasick, but rather to notice the walls, notice the foundations, notice how the water stays in place. And as you in Mexico City well know, earthquakes have limited effects, even though they have traumatic effects. And so what are going to be the limits of the political effects now? So I will back up and talk about very general things in affecting the world political economy. And the first thing I want to talk about is the reemergence of demographic power and the change that means for the world political economy. And this is a very big thing, the rise of population as a factor in political power in the world. For the last 5 centuries, power has been related to productivity, which has been less and less related to numbers of people in a particular country. So you have the possibility of the Netherlands, with its small population but rich population, productive, arms, military, running a slave trade, having colonies like Indonesia, etc. Of course, population still matters. Netherlands in a war with France, Netherlands in a war with Spain, Netherlands eventually with wars with Germany, has big problems. But Netherlands has a colonial image because of that difference. In this century, the productivity per capita of developing countries has been higher than the productivity per capita increase of developed countries. And it's driven not by factors of better governance necessarily, but by urbanization, by mechanization, by industrialization that's occurring. And China is only the leading example of this. So we're going to be living in a world which, by Price Waterhouse estimates, the top 5 economies in 2050 will be, in order, China, India, United States, Indonesia, and Brazil. Those will be the top 5 economies in size. Okay. Now, this is not a demographic revolution because the top 5 richest major economies, they estimate to be the United States, Australia, Germany, South Korea, and Canada. So, Canada is the last one. Notice, I'm sure that Price Waterhouse offices in Tokyo were closed when they made this announcement, because Japan is not on the list. But so we have a situation where the world is changing, but it's not overturning. The rich are still rich. The medium people, however, have moved a lot closer to the rich. And because of population differences, population matters more for other concerns like economics. And this has more indirect effects too. The life chances of individuals in China or India or Indonesia are moving to, are converging with the life chances of people in Europe, Latin America, and the United States. That's in terms of education, in terms of job opportunities, in terms of productivity. They're not reaching those levels, but they're moving toward those levels. There's a convergence rather than a continuing divergence. And of course, one problem with getting richer is that you get older, and the world population is aging, the developed country population is aging, but you know, the populations that are most severely suffering or will be suffering an aging problem are developing countries, because urbanization produces a surge in economic growth, and then all those people moving into from the countryside have small families and larger incomes than they had before. But then those small families mean fewer people to replace and fewer people to take care of the retirees. So we're dealing with a world situation in terms of demographic power. And China is the avatar of this developing country demographic power bunch. The United States is the avatar of the rich countries. And they stand out in those terms, but they're not the only examples of their kind. They're just the largest. Then the second factor I'd emphasize is globalization. The fact is, right now we have no more horizons. Right now, you could be, instead of listening to me, you could be reading the Phnom Penh Post in your email. I don't recommend that necessarily, but the information, there's no more limits on information. With containerization, there's very few limits on transportation and trade. So this the world of horizons, of limits to what you can see and limits to what can affect you. We're in a totally different world now. Our interests and ourselves are still located in that world. We don't homogenize, but we are located in a world with no horizons. And in that world, we have a greater diversity of options as well as challenges. And you can see that in the trade patterns of Mexico or Brazil or China or South Africa, that the trade patterns are no longer limited to particular countries, and no longer limited to product for product exchanges, but partial products and global value chains. So that there's a type of the replacement of exchanges by networks of interchange. It would be very difficult to retrace one's steps, to put to hit the reverse button on the world economy. And the last thing is that power counts in this globalized world. It makes a difference whether you're a productive economy or an unproductive or a developing economy or a failed state or a strong state. Power makes a difference, but it doesn't determine the way it used to. You think of the old hub and spoke arrangement of countries where it's basically dependency on one other partner, then the saying, my way or the highway works. But now, if someone says my way or the highway is much shorter and runs much better and runs to more places. And certainly the policy of any country in this globalized world is to diversify the economic contacts, the political contacts, etc. And Mexico is a good example of that. And this meeting is a good example of that. Okay, the last thing I would emphasize is that U.S. and China are the center of a ring it's the center ring of a global service. Everybody's watching U.S. and China, and indeed that fits because it's the most important bilateral relationship in the world. And with U.S. and China together having 1/3 of the world's economy, it's not something anyone would ignore. And by the fact that each is bigger than the next 3 economies, each is bigger than India, Germany, and Japan combined. It would be a mistake to ignore China or the U.S. or their relationship. But why look anywhere else? Because there's still another 2/3 of the economy out there. And that economy is so larger than the China-U.S. combined economy. But how will China and U.S. relate? Well, it'll be a rivalry, but I will predict no new Cold War. Despite President Trump's occasional defensive statements in that regard, the Cold War was something that, if we look at the Soviet Union isolated itself. And other countries were willing to be in one camp or the other. In this globalized world, it is a mistake for any country to be in one side or the other. No country, Australia, Vietnam, Mexico, Argentina, want to only have a relationship with the U.S. or China. So there will be a great resistance to a Cold War mentality. Moreover, what isolated the Soviet Union was self-isolation. Who built the Berlin Wall? It wasn't the United States. If China is not in the wall building business anymore, then it almost in reversing places with the United States in that rivalry. If it is the open country, it is the open market, and the United States is closing off. So that's a very different situation. Lastly, let me conclude with something that just occurred to me in discussions yesterday, and that is that the situation of Mexico is similar to a country that I know well, Vietnam. Both Mexico and Vietnam have a big neighbor and a significant global other. And the significant global other is important because both Mexico and Vietnam feel the dependency and feel the risk they're at and the dependency on their neighbor. But the global others and other global relationships are very important for counterbalancing, for relieving that sense of dependency. On the other hand, because of that dependency, it would be imprudent for Vietnam to alienate China or for Mexico to alienate the United States. For Vietnam, the United States cannot replace China. For Mexico, China cannot replace the United States. But it can play a vital role in a more globalized economy. So with that thought, I hope that I hope that we can consider the future not quite as uncertain as it seems, though I think it will certainly still be interesting. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Chen and Professor Womack, thank you very much for that introduction, and that I think really set the table for the conversation. There are 2 areas I'd like to ask you to drill down on a little more. The first is, what's the difference between China's new global strategy and its old global strategy? A lot of what's being described as being more globally active, reaching out to the developing world, investing in education, technology, industry, etc., sounds pretty much like what China's been doing the past 25 years. So if you could just tell us 1, 2, 3 things that China's going to do as part of the new global strategy that's actually different than the strategy that's been pursuing, that'd be helpful. And then Professor Womack referred a little bit to the current administration in the United States. Dr. Chen was maybe a little polite But I would like to also ask U.S.-China relations. To what extent is China developing its new global strategy with the U.S. in mind? Is the United States seen as an adversary, as a partner, as a competitor, as a rival? What is that vision that China has for U.S. relations moving forward?
Okay, I try my best. I think the new strategy, at least in my mind, I give you two examples. Example number one, 10 years ago, it was impossible for China to have this Belt and Road Initiative, partly because China was not rich enough. And now I think China is still not rich enough, but it has adequate resources to launch this new initiative. That's number one. The second example is a similar one, AIIB. AIIB was launched around the same time, maybe for different purpose. Again, to show that China can be sort of a regional leader maybe in Asia, not in at a global stage. And all these two examples was not even possible. I mean, 10 years ago, in the minds of Chinese leaders and the scholars. And to the question of U.S.-China relations, I think there are different opinions in China, as there are different opinions in the U.S. Of course, vis-a-vis each other. The most dominant view, increasingly, I believe, is that U.S. Is viewed as a rival to China. I believe that's probably the same case in the US. China is viewed as a rival. A rival is not necessarily a bad thing. A rival does indicate competition. But then again, competition is not necessarily a bad thing. Competition can lead to very good results, as economists would tell you immediately. So it's not, US is not viewed as a threat to China's rise. Even though there might be a tiny bit of people in China who hold that view, certainly that's not the dominant view. And I believe China's rise is not viewed as a threat in the U.S. by the mainstream policymakers and the scholars. So that's why one reason I'm sort of positive on this relationship in the future. I believe it's not economic interdependence; it's really systematic interdependence between China and the U.S. Imagine. About 500,000 Chinese students go to the US to study various subjects, including me 20 years ago, right? So that, I think, experience would create a very strong network, a very solid foundation for future interactions and cooperation. There will be differences, there will be tensions, there will be even struggles, but at the end of the day, I think if we can sit together like today we are doing here, talk to each other, I think the rational, calm people will prevail, and I think the future is uncertain, but it's our making. Thank you very much.
Well, I certainly fully agree with Dingding, both in the optimism as well as the details of the change. The new grand strategy is not a reversal of previous policies. It's a kind of, as Dingding was emphasizing, it's a kind of new empowerment from the capacities that China has built up, and actually overcapacities in some areas where other countries would be very interested in having the infrastructure that China could build for them built, and that would change their economies in Central Asia or in new ports in South Asia or Southeast Asia. So it's not so much a change in direction as it's a change in the resource base. There is a change in mentality, and I think Dingding indicated that in his initial remarks. He was pointing out the difference between Deng Xiaoping's sort of more humble, cautious approach and Xi Jinping's more greater emphasis on China as a new global power. But still, China is not trying to replace the United States in that growth. It doesn't see that as its option. It's not building, for instance, counter-alliances to American alliance structures. It develops partnerships like the comprehensive strategic partnership that China has with Mexico now. And partnerships are, the best thing about partnerships versus alliances is they're open-ended. And so you can have a comprehensive strategic partnership with China and still be a member of NAFTA. So that's a very different approach to being a global power, and China is arguing that strongly. As far as U.S.-China relationships goes, I call the election of Trump an earthquake, but like all earthquakes, there were tectonic tensions before Trump. If you remember, the international, the Asian infrastructure, Asian International Infrastructure Bank. When you get used to initials, it's hard to remember what they stand for. This was joining this was opposed by the United States unsuccessfully, and so Australia and finally the United Kingdom joined. So that was if that had happened under Trump, they'd say, we would all be saying, oh, that's so Trump. But no, it was so Obama. So this problem of the tension, right? The U.S. is in a situation not of being fought and defeated by China, or even outcompeted in many senses, but having the proportion of its share go down. It's not going to like that. It's not going to accept that as the natural way things should be. So there's going to be some defensive actions on the U.S. part. But I think we can expect that to stay within bounds of prudent behavior. Although when the size of buttons is discussed, one wonders how prudent the largest size button is going to be.
Great, thank you. We're almost out of time. One last question. I'll ask you to just give a 1 to 3 sentence answer. And the question is that China, under President Xi's new plan, China aspires to be a leading world power in 2050. And so my question is, what is it that China believes it is today? What does China believe it is today? If it aims to be a leading world power in 2050, then how does China view itself today on the global stage?
Pretty much still a developing country, I guess. We're sort of between developing and developed power country. I think we are somewhere in the middle. So clearly we are not a developed country yet. We have a long way to go. If you look at the GDP per capita, we are still about like $8,000 right? And to get into that club, like OECD club, you need to be over, I don't know, 20,000 or something. That would be like 20 years of work. If, again, it's a if, it could be a big if China's economic growth continues this speed, around 6% to 6.5, which can be very challenging. So I think Chinese leadership and also the Chinese domestic public is very clear about this situation. So we're not there yet. It's aspiration, it's a Chinese dream, and it's for the long term. We still need to focus on a lot of domestic issues, and that's why we even though we're becoming more active, we still want to be cautious. Again, it's two sides of the same coin. Keeping a low profile and also trying to be more active, achieving more results. I think we're gonna stay this way for another 2 or 3 decades. Then, depending on the situation, whether world leading power can be eventually achieved, we don't know yet. It's an open question, but that's the aspiration for this.
I think it's a very shrewd question, because clearly China now, and one might say since 2008 or 2010, it's got more of a sense of having arrived somewhere. Doesn't see that as having arrived as far as it wants to go. There's two things about arriving. One of them is getting somewhere, and one of them is to stop there. They're not stopping here. They have these further goals. getting those goals out there are important. And really, it's worth remembering that if China were even the size of the United States, it wouldn't be getting this much attention because it would not have 4 times the population multiplying its current productivity. So China is a high-level developing country now, and it's hard to get beyond that status. And that's what China's mission is, and it knows it's not a rich country. It is a big country, so if you think of all the things, all the government tasks that are distributed, everybody has to have 3 meals a day, housing, etc. Those are the big concerns for the Chinese budget. And China lives in a neighborhood of 14 land neighbors, and even more obstreperous island neighbors. So that's another aspect of a world in which China has to be cautious, as Dingding was saying.
Great, thank you very much. Well, the good news is we have a whole other panel on China's economic prognosis that will give us some more time to look at these questions. But I very much want to thank Dr. Chen, Professor Womack, and of course the audience. And please give our panelists a round of applause.
Thank you, Diana. That's a perfect transition to our next panel. And so I'll welcome our next panelist up to, I think we need one more chair up to the stage. Elements of China's global strategy are, of course, firmly enshrined now in the party constitution, meaning that Chinese officials will be pursuing them wholeheartedly in the coming years. And this, of course, has implications not only for China's foreign policy, whether in its own neighborhood or out in Latin America, but also for China's own domestic economic development. And these are some of the questions that we'll be addressing now. And so I turn the microphone over to our moderator, Reade.
Thank you, Margaret. The question we have to discuss over the next 45 minutes is really the meta question above all of the other questions. What's happening in China and what's going to happen in China, and how does that affect its relationships abroad? As most folks here know, China's averaged double digits GDP growth annually for the last 30 years. Over 500 million people in China have risen out of extreme poverty. And this has been happened through tremendous emphasis on investment rather than consumption. 10 years ago, it was common for people to say that China had the best highways in the world and also the emptiest because investment had outpaced consumption. Anyone who's been in Beijing traffic in the last few years knows that it's beginning to change. And this very intentional pivot from investment to consumption is expected to slow GDP growth from double digits down to 6 or 6.5% annually, according to the IMF. But there's hopes that consumption as a share of GDP, which is currently one of the lowest in the world, will rise up to more comparable levels for the rest of the world. Now, here to discuss this and how it's going to impact China's relationship with the rest of the world, I'm immensely privileged to introduce a tremendously illustrious panel, really. To my right is Mikko, who is the head of the Geoeconomics and International Security Program at the Mercator Institute for China Studies in Berlin, the largest China-centered think tank in Europe. Prior to that, he taught international political economy and China's foreign relations at the University of Freiburg, where he holds a PhD in political science. He's published extensively on China's international investment strategy and the geopolitical implications of the rise of China as a security actor globally. We'll probably switch the order up some and pass the microphone after that down to Reade, who's one of the world's preeminent experts on China trade policy. She's currently a senior associate with the Freeman Chair on China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., one of the nation's top think tanks on international relations. Prior to that, she had an 8-year tenure at the U.S. Trade Rep's office, first as the Chief Counsel for China Trade Enforcement, and second as the Assistant United States Trade Representative for China Affairs. So I cannot overstate her expertise on China trade. Finally, we have Ferchen, who's a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy in Beijing. He's been on the faculty at Tsinghua University for the last decade, and he runs a center at the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center. He heads a program focused on China's international, political, and economic relations, specifically with emerging economies, such as those here in Latin America. So we have perspectives this afternoon from Washington, D.C., from Beijing, and from Europe on China's economic prognosis and its impacts on the rest of the world. And I can't wait to begin.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Thanks to the organizers for the very kind invitation. It's a wonderful opportunity to speak here, and I'll dive immediately into the substance. I have 3 points to make. The first one, so again, the topic that I'm going to talk about is China's economy, prospects for economic reforms and overseas engagement. And the first one, if we ask about reforms, is we should not expect major breakthroughs in reforms if we think about them in terms of liberalization in China in the next, I guess, 5 to 10 years at least, and then we'll see. What we should expect is a lot of restructuring and also successful restructuring, a lot of continuity and centralization of policymaking, economic policymaking in particular in China. So we see a pretty comprehensive and likely sustained resurgence of statist, i.e. dirigist approaches in economic management in China. And that's partly good news, but partly not. We should not expect, as a second point, a China crisis in the next years to come. And Chinese policymakers are likely to be able to maintain the stability they crave for in the near future. But this happens at a very high cost, and I'll talk about the details of that immediately. It might sound trivial, the fact that we are not expecting a China crisis in the near future, but China is actually coming out of a very difficult and very volatile economic situation, which involves lots of financial risks and also risks for the global economy. Based on this relative stability, the resurgence of the state, what we see is a much more diversified global economic presence of China, and both competition and tensions related to China's current economic policy path are very likely to increase, which is the third point I'm going to discuss. So, on the first point, the headlines look good. You mentioned, Dingding, you mentioned 6.4 as the most likely outcome. I just heard Li Keqiang said it's going to be 6.9, which is surpassing the expectations of even the IMF and others. So that sounds fantastic. Well, let me just note, Inner Mongolia 2 days ago noted that basically all of their figures have been cooked, so we should be careful with these official figures, but anyway, the official narrative looks good too. The direction of policy was made clear at the 19th Party Congress, the annual Central Economic Work Conference just late December. What we expect is a maintenance of economic stability. We'll see a shift towards reducing financial risks. We see China focusing on fulfilling its self-set targets for the 2020 anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, the 100th anniversary, and which means doubling of GDP compared to 2010, doubling of income targets compared to 2010, and also a lot of poverty reduction going on. We also see the ambition to engineer a shift towards quality growth, with less pollution and greater efficiency of capital input. And we should indeed really fully appreciate this focus on stability. Chinese policymakers, in a sense, have delivered. If you look at back just 3 years ago, 2015 was a really difficult crisis year. 16-17, China has recovered continuously through pretty intensive efforts to crack down on financial excesses in the Chinese system. So what was the recipe behind the successes in the past, and what do they mean for the coming months and years? So China is getting its grips on the most risky, shadowy aspects of its pretty wild financial system. In 2017, Beijing showed itself adept at cutting back on the riskier parts of lending while keeping credit flowing to worthy borrowers in the real economy. We have seen very heavy-handed interventions to safeguard financial stability, measures to avoid an exchange rate crisis and prevent capital outflows. We have also seen very difficult capacity cuts in the heavy industries, not to the level that international counterparts had expected them, but they had positive effects on prices, and overall, I think this is a pretty successful strategy. At the same time, we see targeted infrastructure projects, shantytown innovation, easy credit being pumped into the property sector, and also construction thereby picking up, supply sides constraint ensure that material prices rose even more. So we have a combination of demand side stimulus, supply side capacity constraints that help China to grow rapidly while keeping financial risks at bay. So I think it's a pretty fair assessment to say 2018-19 we're on a pretty stable growth trajectory, even if the focus shifts away a bit from the quantitative targets, and that's not only because China is cooking the numbers. So overall, a positive assessment, but what that also means is, even by Chinese standards and ambitions, China's economic reform program remains, to say the least, incomplete. The heavy-handed interventions, all the measures to provide stability, to maintain stability, come at very high costs. Colleagues of mine have looked at the Chinese reform program in terms of 10 major fields, and just to give you a broad overview in terms of what they think Chinese indicators tell us about the success of reforms, and that goes back to the 2013 reform program that the Chinese government has given itself. So basically, in one of these sectors, we see progress, and that's the share of innovation and the industries in economic output. In 5 of 10 areas, we see at best mixed results. This includes financial system reforms, SOE rationalization, trade, land, and environmental reforms. Very limited progress on the ground, continued public display of policy results, but in experiments in local entities in some regions going on, but no fundamental breakthroughs in terms of the overall picture. And then we also see 4 areas where reforms are actually going backwards. So labor reform, competition policy, cross-border investment policy, fiscal policy reforms are all not in line with what the Chinese government itself has planned since 2013. And now if you look back, these plans in 2013 are basically an expression of what in 2006-07, Wen Jiabao, the prime minister at that time, had said is the problem of the Chinese economy. Its imbalance is not sustainable, etc. So it's 12 years that China has been laboring around the most critical problems of its economic development model. And we haven't seen major progress in terms of what the Chinese government itself wants to achieve. So, again, good news, we'll avoid a China shock for the world in the near future, but the cost of that is very high. This means that, in particular, China is continuing to exacerbate 2 fundamental problems of its development model: decreasing capital productivity and leverage. So capital productivity in China is low. The structural investment efficiency problem has not gone away. It means that, for instance, the growth in relatively productive private sector fixed asset investment is running at under 5%, so less than half the rate in 2015. Overall investment growth remains solid only because the state-owned enterprises and local governments continue to build low-return infrastructure projects. And this path is, of course, obviously unsustainable. This is also related to the second problem, of course. The fall in capital productivity is being masked by a rise in system-wide leverage. So it's not the overall debt level. So people are fixated on saying, okay, Chinese debt in relation to GDP is more than 230%. But the real challenge here is corporate debt. It's corporate leverage. It's the way how Chinese enterprises try to make profits, and it's not sustainable. It's actually built on a repressive financial system that channels capital into unsustainable or non-profitable enterprises. And this continues to be the main pattern of economic development in China. So the problem is not awareness of the problem from the side of the Chinese policymakers. It's currently that on top of that, we have a super strategic, ambitious economic policy, industrial policy that not only tries to shape the way how the Chinese economy works, but also how China relates to the world. And this, in fact, increases the problem. So what we see is the overall long-run impact of China's current embrace of economic interventions, ambitious economic interventions, will almost certainly be negative. And this relates also to what we see in terms of its external relations. So, of course, lots of opportunities related to Chinese capital, Chinese investment strategies abroad, but we will see a continuing pattern, a lack of reciprocity in relations with China. So the promise of market openness is not going to be fulfilled in the near future. We will also see Chinese competition by all means. So the key focus of Chinese government and policymakers currently is becoming a leading tech power, and this is they're trying to achieve this with all means available, including protectionist measures, ambitious efforts to shape international standards, and also a strategy called Made in China 2025, which basically means overtaking industrial countries in terms of the market sectors and the shaping of international markets with regard to robotics, AI, other markets. So we will see China both competing with advanced economies and at the same time externalizing its own development model through ambitious outward directed industrial policies. And one of them is, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, in the International Industrial Capacity Cooperation being the slogan here used by the Chinese government, and that's topics, I guess, that colleagues will talk about in a minute. So let me just conclude. China's new technological prowess, powered by continuous rapid GDP growth, the nurture of the single-party state, which is deeply entrenched in economic policymakers and will be for the foreseeable future, makes China into a very different type of global leader, which leads to lots of competition with advanced economies, lots of opportunities for companies to cooperate, and making exactly the balance. So trying to find, seeking out the opportunities and engaging with China, but maintaining sober with regard to what kind of actor we are encountering there is going to be the biggest challenge for policymakers across the world.
Good afternoon, and thank you to our wonderful sponsors for inviting me to be here today. I'm going to take a bit of a different tack because I'm not an economist. I've learned from economists that I'm not one. I'm an international trade lawyer, basically, in my opinion, and I'm not very reformed. So what I'm going to do is talk first a little bit about the history of China's economic reform from the international trade perspective, then give you a look at what Trump has been saying about the problems he sees, the shortcomings he sees in China. And that's because Trump's concerns are also shared by others, maybe to different degrees. And then from there, I'll just take a speculative look at what I think China will be thinking about as it looks forward into the international activities that it wants to undertake in trade and investment. So let me start with a little history of China in the international trading system. There was real optimism about China's economic reforms when China joined the WTO. There really were truly remarkable Chinese reformers who drove China to make the big changes that were necessary. And after China joined the WTO, indeed it dismantled a huge infrastructure of protective and inefficient market barriers. Very impressive. But after about 2005, 2006, some of the optimism really faded because it seemed as if state-owned enterprises, instead of diminishing as a part of China's economy, were becoming stronger. And economic inefficiencies, barriers, discrimination against foreigners in certain sectors, some warning signs seemed to be appearing for the international community interacting with China, both in terms of imports and in terms of investment in China and opportunities, that reciprocity that Mikko was talking about. Then we had another upturn in optimism when Xi Jinping came in, and there was a famous paper that emerged that Mikko was talking about in 2013. It was called the Third Plenum Decision. And one of the key iconic phrases in that decision was the notion that for China, going forward, the market would play a decisive role in allocating resources. That was amazing. That was an indication that we were going to have a major fundamental reform in how China operated. But it didn't work out that way. As Mikko's statistics just indicated, the measures of reform in that document, which was quite detailed, have stalled in many respects. And what's going on? Well, Xi Jinping came in, and in my view, Xi Jinping really felt that control was critical, that if he did not assert control over China in terms of the purity of the Communist Party, so an anti-corruption campaign, the control over the economic levers so that he could ensure that growth continued, because economic growth was a major, major factor in continuing Chinese stability and continuing acceptance of the regime. So he made changes, significant changes. That meant that he liked state-owned enterprises because they were very reliable for executing Chinese policy. That meant that he liked the policy banks because they too could exercise policy and they could do things even when the market said not to. Mikko made a reference to that just now. And they had increased Communist Party presence in both state-owned enterprises for decision-making and in private companies. So, and surveillance over the economy, over the society, also increased. All part of this sense of the need for survival and control. So what was the result economically? Definitely a mixed performance. Definitely very impressive growth, but dragged because of state-owned enterprise inefficiency and various other barriers. And mixed on trading rules to some extent as well. In terms of actual WTO cases, actually did pretty well on many of the WTO rulings, but if you look closely where there was a powerful state-owned enterprise involved, sometimes the results were not necessarily as forthcoming as you would want. Okay, let's turn to Trump's concerns, which, as I say, are reflected in varying degrees by others as well, which is one of the reasons why I think it's important for people in Mexico as they consider their strategic approach to think about these, because it's context, not just for US-China relations, but for understanding the country and what you're dealing with. So from the Trump perspective, China's policies are creating major global distortions, and China is basically much too big to ignore. The US therefore has said that it wants fundamental change in China, and these are some of the policies that the United States has focused on so far. First, China's industrial policies. So policies that subsidize and otherwise give preferences to national champions, domestic champions. If you're a foreigner in China, very hard to say that you will ever assimilate and be considered to be a Chinese. There's just a major barrier there. It also, the industrial policies involve supporting manufacturing, both continuation of production and expansion of production, even when market signals would say stop, retreat, retract. Not a good functioning financial system, as Mikko indicated, with the banks funneling credit where the market would not funnel credit, with a bankruptcy system not operating effectively. Market signals are not getting through in significant areas of the market. Okay, and what's the result of that? In a number of industries, these industrial policies create excess capacity. That means excess production that spills out into global markets, and the United States is very upset about that. Because what happens? It creates problems for industries in other countries that are operating according to market signals. So as prices go down, industries in other areas have plants shut, they reduce capacity, but the Chinese production keeps flowing outbound. So that is something that Trump is very, very concerned about. The other, and by the way, steel is one example, aluminum is another, glass is another, cement is another. There are a number of industries that China itself has identified in this area. And there are major concerns that this industrial policy is going to be even more problematic because it's going to continue with regard to new industries. So for example, solar panels are also viewed as a potential area of problem. Wherever the government's industrial policy is pointing to a desire for more production, more activity, more incentives, everybody rushes in, and without market controls, you end up with these excess capacity problems. So the United States is very concerned about that right now. The other thing that is of concern is IP theft. and possible forced technology transfers, pay to play. You want to be in the Chinese market, you need to give technology transfer, and the notion from some foreigners feeling that they will only be allowed to participate in the market until the Chinese can find a way to get the information, get the value, and then that will be the end of your time. And by the way, China has itself indicated that it's very upset and wants to develop its economy and its value chain so that it is not stuck paying licensing fees, IP fees, fees for the technology that comes from others. It wants to be the one that is generating those fees, that is making others pay for that technology. And that's natural. But you need to then watch the tactics and strategies that you do to try to achieve those goals. So, what's going to happen? I think the US pressure on these points could create fireworks, could create tensions, and could create ups and downs in the relationship. But like Professor Chen, I too think that there are very substantial reasons for this not to create a tectonic shift or earthquake permanently in US-China relations. We don't have time to go into those now, but that's my bottom line for the moment. And I would say that there is also a possibility that there's an upside, which would be that you could potentially see China make some reforms that would then be helpful, because there are those in China who are identifying some of these problems. Okay, what do we have? In any event, I think we have China in the world as an opportunistic, savvy, economic player with a long-term strategic vision that is both economic, but also does not require profit if there are strategic interests that would also indicate the relationship is worth cultivating. So the question that's going to arise is, how is that going to work in the future with the rest of the world? And we'll have to see. But when I turn to Latin America, I see some obvious things. China needs resources, Latin America has them. China would find it very valuable to have more streamlined access to those resources, better infrastructure, and that will also help its infrastructure and construction companies, and can also help with some of that excess capacity. China wants to win the global technology competition. So that means it would be good to expand the use of China's technology in infrastructure, goods and services, intellectual property, in every region around the world, including Latin America. It also would obviously help if China has good markets, good consumer markets for its goods and services everywhere in the world of whatever kind. So that includes Latin America. And finally, on a broader sort of stance, it's very useful for China to gain allies for the development of standards in international fora. So whether they're trade rules about environment or labor or human rights, or anti-corruption rules, or rules about how to use competition law, rules about transparency, rules about data, rules about the internet. These are some areas where China does not have views that are the same as the traditional liberal economies do. And if you have allies, and if you have relationships, and if you have interdependencies, then you can have influence potentially in those organizations. So, for Mexico, China's a big player, can't be ignored, shouldn't be ignored. So, be educated, be aware, and be strategic on your own ground, and there are your opportunities.
Great, well this is a perfect setup, so I get the last word on the panel here, and I'll build on a number of things that my colleagues have said both on this panel and the previous panel. So I'm going to focus a little bit on a few different aspects from a bit of a broader angle, basically on the political economy of China's approach in terms of trying to promote itself as an engine and a leader of development writ large. And this is both for a domestic audience in China and for a more international audience. So I'm going to describe how that works in some detail, and then talk about where I see some of the challenges that China faces in continuing to promote this image of itself as an engine and leader of development. And one of the underlying points I'd like to make about this is simply that we must be cautious in sort of aligning what Chinese leaders say they are going to do, and this includes 50 years, 100 years of planning, and what they are actually capable of doing, both at the domestic level and the international level. So let me talk a little bit about this idea of China trying to promote itself as an engine and leader of development. This has long been the case in domestic politics and economics in China. This goes back to the late 1970s with the post-Mao reforms. Since that time, it has been one of the utmost prerogatives of the party to promote itself as an engine of development. So everything that is happening in China is about development. It has become almost a religion. It has been the case for the last 40 plus years. It must deliver to the people of China on this. One of the easiest ways of judging this over much time has been GDP growth. Now that has changed a lot, but it continues to be paramount that Chinese leaders show to the people of China that they are delivering development, and along with this development and stability continue to be themes. Reform has also been a key aspect of this, but as we've already talked about, there are some problems and challenges with reform, but you continue to see the mantra of reform and development being espoused by leaders for a domestic audience. Now, this is increasingly also the logic of China's foreign policy, especially as it relates to China's relations with developing country regions, and I would put Latin America in that category. The other obvious one is Africa. I think Mexico is a sort of difficult fit for this in a variety of ways, but I think from a Chinese foreign policy point of view, Mexico absolutely still fits in this broader framework. And what China is arguing is, and this is based on its one of its key documents and long-term philosophies, is that China will promote peaceful development, and note that development is a key part of this. And the basic logic, and you see it in all of the discussions about win-win, mutually beneficial relations, is that China must pursue economic activity, opportunity, development for itself, but that pursuit will also benefit all of its economic partners around the world, and this is especially the case for other countries in the process of development. The peaceful part of it is sort of the political outcome that Chinese leaders would like the world to believe is the outcome of this pursuit of development. Why is it win-win? Why is it mutually beneficial? Everyone pursues their own interests and everyone wins, and the outcomes, both economically, politically, contribute to these outcomes of development and peace. Again, this is the logic that is being espoused, and if anything, what I would argue, going back to the previous panel, is that this isn't necessarily new, but it is put on a new plane. It has been the case for a while that this is the core of China's foreign policy, especially as it relates to its engagement with developing countries, but it is increasingly the case under Xi Jinping. So you see constantly these references to development and peace, and that China will promote this on the international stage. So we see this also in some of the new initiatives that have already been discussed. So the Belt and Road Initiative is often framed as a policy, as an initiative that will continue to promote development opportunities for China's neighbors and well beyond, and will also pin security and stability. This, again, is what the Chinese government is trying to sell. So again, really trying to promote both for a domestic audience and for its own neighborhood, and much further beyond, that China is an engine and leader of economic development with all of the good outcomes that come with that. China has really sort of doubled down on this philosophy under Xi Jinping. It has not left this behind at all. It has increasingly emphasized this, and we see it again in things like Belt and Road, and we see it in the sort of opportunity to step into a space where the United States, under the Trump administration, is maybe stepping back from some of its engagement. So now let me talk a little bit about why these efforts at promoting itself as an agent and leader of economic development are challenged both at the domestic and the international level. I think we've already heard about this, and I'm in agreement with my colleagues here that the general sense, certainly not in China, and certainly not the way that, well, maybe among some or maybe many in China, but certainly not the official level, that reform is stalled. I would agree with this, or that it at least has come up against serious challenges, and that major vested interests, including SOEs and others, have made reform of certain types very difficult. So what has sort of become almost more important in a sense than reform, at least of the liberalizing type, is this idea of stability. So increasingly now when we see the term stability presented to us in the Chinese economic context, we should probably see this as a sort of effort to probably tamp down some of the more aggressive efforts at reform that people had talked about in that sort of era, so before and immediately after China's entry into the WTO. So again, we see this in the financial sector and the SOE sector. So I won't go into that anymore. I think my colleagues have covered that well. Abroad, I think there are a range of challenges for China in trying to promote itself again as an agent and leader of development. The first of them, and this was touched on in the first panel, is simply China's size, its growth, and its increasing aspirations and ambitions. All of these make it increasingly difficult for China, even compared to 5, 10, 15 years ago, to promote itself as one of the other developing countries in the world. Its neighbors, countries in Africa, countries elsewhere, increasingly look skeptically at that. Not completely dismissive, but skeptically. Second of all, there are structural features in the international economy, especially as it relates to commodity trade and investment, which make the situation for China much more difficult. From the early 2000s up until 2013, 2014, during the commodity boom, China could really emphasize this sort of win-win relations based on commodity complementarity with countries, especially in South America, and Africa, and elsewhere. This is much more difficult of a sell in the years since the end of the commodity boom. We still have a lot of emphasis on commodity trade, investment, and finance, but the situation is much more difficult for a lot of the countries that are exporting these raw materials. Again, this makes it more difficult for China to sell its line that it is an agent and leader of economic development when it comes to complementarity. And then finally, again, echoing the comments of the other panelists, simply that China's own industrial policies make its own reform process difficult, but also put it in direct competition, not only with other industrialized economies, but potentially also with other developing countries who don't just want to be exporters of raw materials or sort of be on the receiving end of China's industrial policies. Increasingly, countries around the world ask, how can we also have some of that development miracle that China had using some of their instruments? If everyone's got these industrial policies, this makes things very difficult. Again, a challenge for China in terms of trying to sell this virtuous circle. Let me conclude then with a few comments on where this is all headed. So despite these challenges, I do not see this emphasis by China on its role as an agent and leader of development going anywhere. In fact, it was re-emphasized during the recent Party Congress. China is increasingly stressing under Xi Jinping's leadership that it is a model of economic development itself and that it will be an engine of economic development for everyone. And that we see this sort of encapsulated in the Belt and Road Initiative. If anything, I see it as a sort of symbol of these aspirations for China to show to the world that it is an engine and leader of economic development. It is also, again, for a domestic audience to show the people of China that it has these new aspirations, but they're very much in line with the continuing emphasis on development opportunities that will be good for China and good for the world. And it would like to emphasize to its neighbors and to others that it is a sort of benevolent leader, again, wanting to portray its key role as an agent of development. And just to conclude then by saying that none of this will be easy. It's sort of ironic in a sense, given the last panel and then this panel. There are these new, large aspirations that China has for itself and for its role in the world, and yet it is confronted with serious, serious challenges both at the domestic and the international level. And all I will say about that is that that shouldn't lead us down the road of sheer pessimism. China from the outset has faced almost insurmountable odds in getting to where it has today. So this sort of leaves us somewhere in between. Huge aspirations, huge challenges. Thank you.
I want to give a huge thank you to our panelists for staying within time, especially impressive given that we have one additional person on this panel. In the 5 minutes that we have left of this panel, I'd like to ask you each to answer just one more question to get the discussion going for our Q&A section after the final panel. Each of you in turn expressed some skepticism about official rhetoric, about market reforms that may have stalled, Matt about win-win and outward relationships, and Mikko even about the underlying economic numbers themselves. I want to thank you for your candor and ask you to extend the same analytic eye towards a phrase that China watchers have been hearing a lot since the 19th Party Congress, but that I haven't heard any of you mention on this panel, and that is the phrase 21st century socialism with Chinese characteristics. We hear this phrase all the time. We heard President Xi emphasize it quite a bit in the last Party Congress. That implies a certain amount of continuity, right? Socialism has the main part of that phrase, but we see it modified by 21st century and with Chinese characteristics. In other words, it will be uniquely modern and uniquely Chinese, not what one would expect from socialism in, say, France or Sweden. I'd like if each of you could take just a few minutes and turn that same analytic and potentially even skeptical eye towards this new rhetoric and this new framework for Chinese economic and international policy.
Of course.
Okay. Is this one on? Yeah, this one's on. Okay, I'm going to start because I get that gives me the easiest place in line. Okay, China loves to have slogans that are broad enough that they can mean anything China needs them to mean and allow maximum flexibility, right? So, 21st century, who can complain about that? Socialism, we know that's a Communist Party mantra. With Chinese characteristics, that's always socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's been around for a very long time as a phrase. So this gives them the opportunity to do whatever Xi Jinping wants.
If I echo some of that, as I've lived in China for the better part of the last 17 years, and so I've been through a few different rounds of leadership changes, and some quite difficult to decipher official slogans, and I think this is just sort of part of the way in which each leadership team in China tries to put its own stamp on its own administration, and we should sort of recognize this from politics in our own countries. I think in Mexico and the United States, this is certainly the case. Each leader has to put their stamp on things, and I think that's part of what Xi Jinping is doing. And I'd also agree that in general, the more flexibility there is to certain terms, and I go back to the key idea of development. Development is incredibly flexible, as is reform, such that it is very difficult for any leader or the party more generally or the government to be sort of pinned down in terms of saying, well, you are no longer providing what you said you were going to provide. So these, like, socialism is everything. It can't be denied in some sense. So it's very flexible and helpful in that way in terms of leadership.
I think I have a slightly different perspective on that. I do believe that these terms express something very important, and one aspect of that is Xi is shaping his own and describing his own legacy. This is really about internal party politics. He is the guy who brings the party into the new century, and he makes sure that the party is going to be power for the next 100 years. So it's a historical mission, and this is being encapsulated by that. It means socialist in that case certainly means the persistence of the party as the one entity that shapes politics and economic policy in China for the future. But it also means, if you talk about the 21st century, it means something that we at our institute have called a form of digital Leninism. So using digital means, using modern means to govern inside China, but also capturing everything that digitization means for manufacturing, for production, for finance. And so it's really modernizing the party to be able to use these new resources to govern externally, internally, and also to succeed economically and externally. So I think it's much more than just a slogan. It really means she wants to make the party fit for that new century.
Well, thank you, everybody. That is time. I think we've raised more questions even just in that last round of answers than I had anticipated. So I really look forward to the Q&A session at the end of this afternoon's program. But thank you all. I'll turn this back over to Margaret to introduce the final panel.
Thank you to our panelists for a very insightful discussion. We'll now move on to a discussion of China-Mexico relations. Very pertinent. And so I'd like to please invite our panelists, Reade and Yang Jimin, and our moderator, Sam Levy.
Good afternoon to everyone. This lot of conversation may be the one who can be more concerned about, especially this topic, more than Mexico or Mexican stakeholders. Maybe we can think about American stakeholders. So this prospect of Mexico-China relationship is a matter that started to be discussed on a topic or on different kind of ideas, but moreover, we need to define and understand from which perspective we need to approach the way to build answers in this kind of questions, prospect of China-Mexico future. Basically, one of the most important ideas from what we are going to discuss is to understand the future of NAFTA reshaping in the following months. For that matter, maybe we can say that the great winner of NAFTA is not necessarily Mexico, Canada, or US, but maybe China. So for that matter, I would like to introduce one of the most important Latin American analysts, a great teacher of the Mexico-China relationship, who leads one of the most important efforts in China to understand not merely the bilateral relationship between Mexico and China, but moreover with the Latin American region. Mr. and Professor Jinan, thank you very much to be here in Mexico. 欢迎到墨西哥，我们很荣幸。Another great stakeholder, not merely in the academia, but more in, I can say, in industry, in government, private sector, is one of the most important, if I can say that word, pusher of the relationship between China and Mexico, Professor Enrique Doso. He leads one of the most important efforts as well in National University of Mexico. He leads as well the Mexico-China Center at Main University of Mexico. Enrique, thank you very much to be here and to share with us your thoughts. To open the conversation, I would like just to put a bit of thoughts on the table. We can say, or can we think about that the future of the relationship is going to be determined of the political future of Mexico, or if we're facing an opportunity because this political next election to change or at least analyze the economic system in Mexico, is this is a good opportunity for China to bring the social, political, and economic policies to influence in Mexico decisions? Those kind of thoughts or questions maybe could be a good platform just to discuss. Professor Yang, thank you very much, and welcome with your thoughts.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's my honor. Okay, evening?
Yes. It's not China time.
So correct. So thank you so much for the dialogue and policy and other organizers to be here. I like this meeting room. We can eat and we can talk. So because yesterday we have private meeting. Sorry, we have private meeting, right? I talked a lot on the China-Mexico bilateral ties. So today I cannot repeat it again. So I'd like to tell you something about my opinion and also some story. Nowadays in China, we want to tell story to foreigners. I will share you some experience of mine. The first is when we look forward the future of China-Mexico relations, bilateral ties, we should retrospect what we have done in last 5 years. I mean, after the Peña Nieto came in power, what we have done. I think for one hand, our bilateral political relationship reached in a new high. The simple is that we signed the comprehensive strategic partnership, right? This at the political field. And on the other, bilateral economic cooperation. I think most participants or audience here are care about the bilateral economic cooperation, China and Mexico. And in fact, maybe some experts talked about that they are not satisfied with the performance during the last 5 years. Me too. But in terms of figures released by not only by the Mexican side, the Ministry of Economy, and also the National Bureau of Statistics of China, the bilateral trade investment keep growing year by year. So I think, judging from political side, economic cooperation, I think it's laid a solid base for the future cooperation between China and Mexico. No matter, I think this year is the crucial year for Mexico. You will have a new president, right? And he, maybe she, will be coming to power next year, in early next year, right? So I think no matter who win election, and no matter which party win election, I'm sure the solid base that laid by the two top leaders, both by President Jinping and also by Peña Nieto, I think it laid a solid base for long-term cooperation. I'm sure. I'm a little bit optimistic on the bilateral cooperation. Maybe somebody else holds the different views. It doesn't matter because I like Mexico and China. So I hope the bilateral ties can be smoothly, healthily, not only in the short run, in the last 5 years, but also in the long run. Maybe next 10 years, or maybe 100 years. Maybe after I die, I think it keep the good momentum. The second is the challenger. I think Mexico is far from China, right? It took me more than 24 hours from Beijing and transfer flight at Frankfurt and finally arrived in Mexico City, right? It's a long journey.
You saw Mexico.
Yes. So I think about each of the MOU signed by both governments, each of the investments made by the investors, and each of the trade made by the businessmen. It's not very easy. You know, they will conquer how many difficulties to shipment all the goods from China to Mexico, and also that to China. So it's not easy for us. Have you thought about that we can sign or upgrade our bilateral relationship to the comprehensive strategic partnership? You are the closest neighbor of the big power of the United States. Can you thought about 46 years ago, right? So the world is changing. The region, the situation is changing in the Western Hemisphere, and also that changing in Mexico. And also I think so many changes have happened in China. So facing the change, I think we should hold some, I cannot use the terms made by Hillary Clinton, smart power, right? But I think I can use it. It's different. I mean that we should zoom in. That means we should care some specific issues between the bilateral ties, such as the sector, the industrial, or even firm level issues, or even the trade imbalance between us. But well, most important that we should zoom out. Zoom out means that we should have a long vision on the bilateral relationship, make a strategy in the long run to keep the bilateral ties I mentioned just now developed very healthily and smoothly. So that, I think if you just pay more attention to some problems, somebody else always want to give up some example like the high-speed train, right? That CRC, China Railway Construction failed to get the bid, or failed to construct the railways in Mexico. I think it doesn't matter. There are so many failures that Chinese businessmen have made in not only in Mexico but also in whole America. I think we should learn. We should understand each other. We should have a new thinking to develop bilateral ties. This is second point. The last point, I want to share some of my experience. What I have done, how to advance the bilateral relationship between China and Mexico. You know, I like the United States. I once studied at UCSD. I also like the TV comedy. I watched one TV comedy named Everybody Loves Raymond, right? This make me think of that. Raymond, we cannot be Raymond. Make everybody love us, like us, right? But that means it's very difficult to make each of the Mexican love China, know China, understand China, and also the same to Chinese. But I think that most important is the key minorities. That is important. Can direct the bilateral relation, the direction. So that including the diplomats, the politicians, scholars, and the young scholars. I saw some young scholars here, right? So they belong to the key minorities. So we should grasp these small groups. And second, I also studied in UCSD with my tutor, Enrique Dussel, for 1 year. So I consider Mexico as my second hometown. I love this country. When I returned to China, I set one circle, a community in the cyber, WeChat. We named it Mexico Party. It's not Tea Party, right? It's only a community, academic community. The members of this community came from different units, like the Beijing International Studies University, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or different institutions. But we have the same goal to do something to develop the bilateral relationship between China and Mexico. I think we got it. We not only successfully held the seminar, and we were published book, and we also held so many discussions, and we signed the MOU between the different units. So I think if you want to do something, you'd better travel to China to know China well. And this is what I want to talk. Finally, the 1 minute. I want to respond one speaker here. I think that her speech made me think of the speech ever made by the former Canadian Prime Minister Mariana, right? He said that Canada, compared with China, Canada is a small country, only have 300 thousand population. And China have 1.3 billion, more than that, right? And a prime minister of small country. It's irrational to ask me to tell the premier of China to do something, because he is the leader of big country. He lead a country with 1.3 billion population. I mean that, please don't get something. If you live in China, you are known. It's very difficult to lead a huge country, right? The development in China, we have the third world. We can divide it into three worlds. The well-developed areas in the coastal area, the less developed, and the most developed areas, right? So I don't know how to divide it, right? So it's very difficult. We have 55 minorities, so it's very difficult. So welcome all of you, if you want to do something, to visit China, to live there for a long time. If you like, you can contact me. I will give you my card. And welcome to visit my institute, Elas class. And also, I will receive you and offer you lunch. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jinan. One of the most important pieces of the puzzle of the Mexico-China relationship could be the question to understand the destiny of, if I can say, the industrial policy in Mexico, or to understand maybe the G2G, the government-to-government projects or relationships. So, Professor Yang, it's very important your feedback about the recent mismatch between Mexico and China and about your thought. We realize and we put a lot of attention of your vision for the long trip, but it doesn't matter merely an opinion. Also, we need just to understand our behavior in order to build a long-term relationship, but moreover, we need to create a dialogue, not merely a monologue, right? So for another topics, I would like just to introduce Mr. Professor Enrique Dusso for his thoughts. Thank you, Enrique.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much to COMEXI for the invitation, and also to Margaret for being here. And it's an honor to be with Simon and Professor Yang Ximin. No? So the topic is what to do with China. No? We've heard 3-4 hours now what is China expecting to do, discussions, domestic discussions, international discussions, the relationship, the tensions between the United States and China. How are we going to dance with this dragon? No? Are we going to dance, or are we going to be alone, or what are we going to do? No? 7 brief topics that I would like to share with you. No? So, to start with, I think Mexico has, of course, an enormous potential with China and with the Chinese relationships, but unfortunately, we have to work. No? It will not happen automatically. And Mexico has not done its homework vis-a-vis China. We don't know what to do with China. And B, we have wasted massive opportunities. Mexico was one of the first countries 46 years ago that started a diplomatic relationship with China in 1972, and since then we keep on discussing the opportunities. And I would always say, excuse me, and where is the reality? Oh. So lots of opportunities, lots of wasted opportunities. By the way, we are not the only one. No? Argentina, Chile, Vietnam, Germany, the United States are all looking how to dance with this dragon, I would say, the new rich guy in town. No? And what are we going to do with this new rich guy in town? So first topic, again, I would simply highlight, yes, enormous wasted potential. In this sexennium in Mexico, we have wasted 5 years, no? Because I don't see any concrete developments independently of the political party. Second topic, no? We have to improve the quality of analysis and knowledge of China, and we have to improve the institutions that work on China. And on this topic, we are all responsible. We love to say, yes, the public sector and the government corrupt, inefficient, unproductive, in whatever. Regarding the analysis and knowledge of China, we are all involved, the public sector, the private sector, and the academic sector. What are we doing on China? What we're witnessing in Mexico is that what we know of China is very little. No? We still think of a China of the 1990s. And today, China alone, and in its relationship with Mexico, it has gotten increasingly sophisticated and much more complex. We cannot analyze China with the same concepts that we analyzed it 20 or 30 years ago. My suggestion and proposal, I will get into it in a moment, is that we need to analyze China at least on 4 topics. One is trade. This year, we will celebrate, some will celebrate it more, some will celebrate it less, but this year we will celebrate 15 years of China being Mexico's second trading partner. 15 years. Not 15 months, no, since 2003. So trade is the first important topic. And here we have to be more sophisticated. It's not sufficient to say, yes, growth has increased and imports have, I don't know what, and that's the trade analysis. No, a trade analysis is at the 10-digit level in specific value-added chains and still is not equal to auto parts, to garments, to shoes, to... Let's start to work. Who is doing this work? I don't know too many. Private institutions, public institutions, academic institutions. So first topic, trade. Second topic, financing. No? Kevin Gallagher, Boston University, has been working a lot on the topic of financing. In the topic of financing, the relationship between China and Mexico is very weak, no? For whatever reasons. But Mexico does not require today, maybe tomorrow, but today does not require financing from China. Third topic, foreign direct investment. I will get back to this. And fourth topic, infrastructure projects. topics. It is very important not to mix up these four topics, because that's what usually happens in this kind of discussion. So you put a little bit of trade, a little bit of international relations, a little bit of infrastructure, and you end up saying nothing. No. Policy proposals, yes, whatever. No. So you need to differentiate, to separate, and to specialize on each of these topics. When are we going to start? Private sector, public sector, academics in Mexico. Very weak. No? Third topic, I would say, very surprisingly, we have extremely weak institutions that work on China and Mexico too. We love to say, yes, the public sector, again, corrupt, unproductive, inefficient. And where is the private sector? Where is the academic sector? Very weak institutions. Also, the foreign ministry is very weak working on China. The Secretaría de Economy, the Presidencia are very weak on China. But so is the private sector, and so is the academic sector. I would expect to have dozens of institutions working on China. Look who's working, who's doing the work. Very few. No? Again, I don't want to mention any particular names, but it is very surprising that you would expect dozens of institutions, and they don't exist, not in Mexico in 2018, maybe tomorrow. Fourth topic. Since 2013, and several have mentioned, and Professor Yang mentioned, since 2013, Mexico and China have this strategic, comprehensive, or integral association. 5 years. Nobody knows what it means today, yesterday, and the day after tomorrow, not to speak of 2050. Now, what does this mean in very concrete terms, in terms of trade, financing, foreign direct investment, and infrastructure projects? There is simply no evaluation, no discussion, no analysis on the topic. No. This is, again, very surprising. And I don't have sufficient time, but in terms of trade, I will remind you. So China is our second major trading partner. We have, based on Mexican statistics, a 14-to-1 import-export relationship. So we are massively importing, exporting very little. Of the top 10 exporting countries for Mexico, China is the only one in the last 5 years where exports have decreased. Nobody's discussing this. It's very fashionable and sexy to say, yes, China, if Trump does not want to trade with us, we will export to China. I would say I would be the fool on the hill and say, excuse me, our exports in the last 5 years are decreasing. The rest is wishful thinking. Which is fine. I don't have anything against wishful thinking, but it's not reality. Trade, Mexican exports have decreased. And finally, regarding trade, 91% of Mexican imports from China are capital goods and intermediate goods. So it's very easy to say, to enter into a discussion of China bashing in terms of trade, capital goods and intermediate goods. So to substitute for these imports or to increase exports is going to be extremely difficult. First topic. The topic of financing, I will skip it. Third topic of analysis, foreign direct investment. In the last years until 2017, according to the Secretaría de Economía, Mexico has attracted less than $800 million of Chinese foreign direct investment. Accumulated until 2000. This is less than 0.1% of Mexico's foreign direct investment. Why? Is this a coincidence? No, no coincidence. Look at the work we have been doing at the Center for Chinese-Mexican Studies and other places. Chinese foreign direct investment finds it extremely difficult to invest in Mexico. So, okay, the political decision can be, we do not want Chinese investment. Okay, that's one option. But if we still are thinking like the President, like the Secretaría de Economía, like many others, that we want to attract Chinese investment, we have to work specifically on what exists. No, not only wishful thinking. So it's no coincidence that Chinese investment is so low, and by the way, will not increase if the Mexican government and the private and public sectors do not work specifically on this topic. And finally, fourth topic, infrastructure projects. Infrastructure projects from a Chinese perspective are strategically relevant in this One Belt, One Road initiative. Mexico is the world champion regarding Chinese infrastructure projects. Of 3 projects, we have 3 cancellations. The Dragon Mart, the fast speed train, and Chihuahua 2. Who discusses this in Mexico? Again, it is very sexy to discuss China and China tomorrow and the day after tomorrow and the China 2050. Who knows of Chihuahua 2? If Chihuahua 2, a hydroelectric infrastructure project in Chiapas of $405 million fails, forget about the relationship in the last 50 years. I mean, I know that our Chinese friends are very patient, but they will say, look, this tropical country is very difficult, and we can work in Cuba, in Venezuela, and Uruguay, not in Mexico. So when are we going to work? Not on 2050, but on today. Chihuahua 2, Secretaría de Gobernación, Foreign Ministry, Secretaría de Economía, and others. I don't see this. Fifth, and I'm finishing, 2 or 3 brief topics. So I would say, fifth point, China is, of course, today for Mexico not an option or an alternative to the United States. One, Mexico has already diversified very dramatically. I hope that our academic colleagues and others assess this. In 2000, 81% of Mexico's trade was with the United States. Today, 2016, we will soon get the data for 2017, it fell from 81% to 63%. What is the counterpart? China. So we have already diversified in a very, of course, trade, exports and imports. Banco de Mexico, I can send it to you, official data, fell from 81% to 63%. And China's trade increased from less than 1% to 10%. Trade, Mexican trade with China. So there is already an important diversification, but we have very specific problems with China that have not been attended. Sixth and seventh point. So there is a political will. President Xi Jinping and Peña Nieto have met 7 times. Yesterday we heard that maybe even 8 times. It was a secret meeting, I don't know where, but 7 or 8 times, there is a political will, there is a good political relationship between both presidents, both wives are friends and whatever, but the secretaries, the operators in China and in Mexico are not able to allow to implement these policies. Well, yes, they say we will do this and strategic and comprehensive and whatever, it does not work. Last topic. What to do in 2018 from the Mexican perspective. I would remind you that today we have hundreds of proposals of what to do in Mexico vis-a-vis China. In 2009, 2010, you can look at our center, there is a proposal that was worked under President Fox, un grupo de trabajo, a working group on China, Mexico, 20, 30 pages on the topic, on specific topics. The best study of what to do was probably under the leadership of Agenda Asia and Simon in 2012, a submitted book to the presidential candidate Enrique Peña Nieto, 250 pages, 100 proposals in economics, political topics, sports, culture, etc. 100 proposals. I believe, unfortunately, that very people have read it. No? And in 2016, there is an agenda by 19 analysts, public sector, private sector, academics, of an agenda Mexico-China 2016-2018. So lots of proposals. So who wants to work and start on these proposals? I would say let's start yesterday and not tomorrow. Some of the topics, no? I would say tourism, visas, for example. The Chinese ambassador, since he arrived to Mexico, says China does not grant visas to Chinese persons and visitors, etc. Many people know the discussion for a long time. I don't know if it is true or not true. When are we going to finish the topic? We know this for a long time. Statistics, no? Chinese say they export to Mexico 25 billion. We say we import from China 70 billion. The difference is 300%. When are we going to start working? We have topics regarding culture, education, academics, trade, etc., etc. So I finalize with a positive note, if you want to. There are a lot of proposals, very specific, in electronics, in telecommunications, in auto parts, in automobiles, etc. And I would invite all of you, stop whining and stop lamenting on the public sector. Let's start working in the public sector, in the private sector, in the academic sector. And by the way, in Mexico in 2018, let's start working in whatever political party you want, left, right, whatever. There is not one political party today in Mexico, of the main four, that knows anything of China. No? So we have to integrate the topic of China in the agenda of the political parties. What is the Mexican dream vis-a-vis China? Do we have a dream? We are very good in saying, se vale soñar, no? What is our dream vis-a-vis China? Let's start yesterday, not tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dussel. I do agree with you in several of your thoughts. I would like to just to settle and share a plot of 5 ideas of this conversation. The first one is, in my opinion, China definitely is not a hedge stakeholder of at least of the NAFTA future and the relationship between Mexico and US. The destiny of the Mexico-China relationship, at least in the following 10, 15 years, is going to be defined under the reshaping process of NAFTA. If we analyze for each 10 US dollar that we bring from our surplus of NAFTA, we send 5 US dollars to China. It's more or less what Enrique said above. So, as I said at the beginning, one of the most important winners of the relationship or the NAFTA is China. The second point is this discussion between China and Latin America right now and on the future is not going to be anymore about this schizophrenia relationship between TPP or NAFTA. China has created a new platform, a new kind of idea of integrations process between the Silk Road and the corridors. So this is much more a term of geopolitical platform than merely a platform of trade, international trade, or what we try to implement 25, 30 years ago with NAFTA. So Xi Jinping is introducing to many regions his idea of regional corridors, and Latin America is an important region to be linked with this new platform of geopolitical relationship. So in that matter, on that table we will have more the opportunity to discuss if we understand these kind of geopolitical platforms much more than economic or international trade platforms. The next point is the relationship between Mexico and China, in my opinion, is not going to be merely centered or pointed on the trade, bilateral trade, or trade mismatches. The future of political elections in the following months will leave a new future of China-Mexico agenda. And the south of Mexico will be an important region for social cooperation with China. So we will have, and I strongly believe that the future of China and Mexico is going to be led not by P2P, private to private, but to G2G, government to government projects. So we will see in a very short time, the disembark of regional development banks of China. Actually, the China Development Bank in Mexico arrived several years ago. They are analyzing, they are checking, they are trying to understand the behavior of Mexico government. So in Chinese is man lai, is step by step. So I believe that we will see a very important project on infrastructure. We will see a very important relationship based moreover or much more than trade, and it's going to be led by financial cooperation. Because, in my opinion, the future of international trade that is going to be led by China is investment through trade. So China is very interested in natural resources in Mexico, and we will see this kind of agreements and financial cooperation. And the last point is, as I said, the G2G project is going to be, in my opinion, the future of the relationship, because, as Enrique said, and many stakeholders in Mexico recognizes, that we are not ready to understand the puzzle between China and Mexico. But the way that we are going to create at least a new open platform for China, and because it's the Chinese willingness to make business with government. So this is a question that US and a lot of American stakeholders, I bet they are going to be very sharp on that point. So I can bet that we're going to see in the following months a disembark of regional development banks, and moreover, a lot of multinationals, or if I can say in terms of social economy, state-owned companies. So the state-owned companies, they're going to open the Mexican market, and for Mexico, for Mexican stakeholders, for Mexican private stakeholders and governments, we need to understand our homework. We need to understand how the state-owned companies from China, the Chinese state-owned companies, works. Their logic is not based in markets. Their logic is based in politics. Their logic is not based in surplus or profits or loss. Their logic is based in geopolitics. So this is much more important to answer the questions of Enrique. If we do not enter in our homework, we're not going to have at least a safe future between China and Mexico. For that reason, I strongly believe that China is not going to be a hedge for the relationship, at least, or the reality against reality with Trump. Thank you very much, and we are open for questions to us, or for any kind of question you willing to put on the table. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jervon Minto, I'm one of the young scholars with the dialogue for this year. I guess my question is, I think one of the most consequential statements that I heard today was that what's happening is that Mexico is in a similar position to China, to the US as Vietnam is to China. So my question really surrounds how does Mexico triangulate its relationship with China and the US, and what are the areas for giving and taking in this relationship?
Yes. Maybe we will have two more questions and then we will answer them. If we have, at least.
Okay. Just one question. You were talking about how the relationship between China and US is something to look out for. I'm wondering, we have seen in a couple of last months, we have seen two major China and US companies deals fall through. One was the Alibaba MoneyGram deal, like late November, I think. And just this week, there it says AT&T dropped a deal with Huawei to sell their cell phones in the US. What is the perspective for Chinese companies and American companies to go beyond or go around China and US as governments in this relationship and in these deals? What can Chinese companies can look for to get these deals done, because they're getting political pressure too, and some of the companies are like going for that. Some American companies.
Thank you. The questions are open for all panelists, so if you want to ask them as well, and if you can share microphones for them, please. Thank you. A third one?
Thank you very much. Well, I have a question about, well, we Mexicans are very critical of our own country, and we're all the time like, asking, well, why won't we do this, why did this mistake, and so on. There's a Chinese saying that to clap, you need two hands. So for any bilateral relationship, you have to have the two parts. So in your opinion, or maybe from other panelists, what could be the shortcomings of the Chinese approach to Mexico? What could be the mistakes or wrong approach that China has taken towards Mexico? Thank you.
So the first
the question is how Mexico deal with the triangular relationship, right? You know, it's about 5 years ago, we were in DC. We talked about the so-called China, US, Latin American triangular relationship, or the trilateral relationship. You know, I'm a little bit disagree with the framework to talk about the relationship among China, Mexico, and the United States, because I don't think we should link the relationship between China and Mexico with that of China, United States, or Mexico, United States. You know, the relationship, take for example, the relationship between China, Mexico, and China-US relationship is a symmetry, right? Because the United States is important both for China and Mexico. But on the contrary, I think China is less important to Mexico. And it's same as to China, right? When we compare. So how, yesterday we talked about maybe if we use some factor to analysis what the effect of this factor on other factors, you should have the logic, a framework. You should have your own measures, like the quantitative measures, right? You can find what the correlations
among the three factors. So it's very difficult. You cannot draw your conclusion emotional. Otherwise, I think maybe it's a hot topic, right? China, US, Mexico. It's very hot. I do think there is some relationship under the circumstances of the changing of the US-Mexico relationship under the renegotiation of NAFTA, other relationship on that China-Mexico, but I cannot find the direct link, the direct effect. So maybe we should think about if there exists the so-called the triangular relationship. Thank you so much.
Yes, just regarding Chinese firms in Mexico, no? Again, I would invite you to go through several of these case studies we have been doing of Chinese firms in Mexico, but also in Brazil, in Argentina, Peru, and other places. I would tell you, in the Mexican case, why has been the Chinese investments in Mexico so difficult? Because in most of the cases, regarding what are the shortcomings of China in Latin America and Mexico, in most of the cases, Chinese firms are not prepared to invest outside of China. No? Yes, you have Huawei, you have CTE, you have Hutchinson Horse, they are very well prepared. But when you see case studies at the firm level, I invite you to look, for example, the case study of First Automotive Works in Pachuca, 100 kilometers away from here. They started in 2008, and from 2008 to 2015, they had a 2,000% productivity growth. So you said, wow, that's amazing. Again, they produced light trucks. Yes, again, productivity always depends on your basis. And so if your basis is very low, you end up with 2,000%. So at the beginning, they were producing Frankensteins with 7 wheels, and after 7 or 8 years, they started producing, as they should, light trucks, and it is working. And by the way, it's not any firm. They are doing this joint venture with Grupo Carso in Mexico, that, as you well know, is very important in Mexico. No? So there is a very long learning period from both sides, and I could tell you a lot of anecdotes. I don't have time, but they had to do engineering changes, they had to do financial changes, they sent engineers to Mexico, Mexican had to go there, they asked for tires and got harnesses, and they had to number parts of auto parts, they had never done it before, etc. So it's a long learning process. So the people that believe they will invest on Friday and you will start producing on Monday, big problem. Not in Mexico, not in most of Latin America. And second question regarding the shortcomings, we would make a long list. Again, I would say most of the criticisms and blames that we're saying on Mexico, it's a mirror in China, which is the quality of analysis in China, specifically on Mexico, is surprisingly, with excellent exceptions, very low. No, there are massive institutes, we joke about this, we make jokes on Mexico, on China, and on many places. So yesterday the Mexican ambassador was saying there are 68 Latin American institutes and centers in China, out of which if 60 if 8 are real, that's a lot. The other 60 are they open on weekends. No? So next week we will have the meeting of the CELAC China Forum, and so Chinese have not done their homework. And so what will they monitor? What will they evaluate? If Mexico has not been able to make proposals, neither has the part from China either. No? So I think it's on both parts. As you say, you need both hands, and I think both hands have had strong shortcomings. No, it's not only the Mexican part, but since we are in Mexico and we have a Mexican audience, it would be unfair to speak to a Chinese audience.
Thank you very much, Enrique. On behalf of all panelists, we would like to thank Dr. Luis Rubio and all his crew for this amazing event. And thank you very much for all of your time. And if you have another lot of questions, COMEXI team is going to be open to send us the questions, and of course we will answer them. Thank you very much, and have a good evening. Thank you very much.